Apologies. Greg lay on his back, completely still. Even with one nostril plugged, he picked up the oily scent left over from last night's dust mopping. He watched the second hand of the big wall clock and listened to Mr. Z's deep breaths. His math teacher was also stretched out on the floor, about 10 feet away. And Greg thought, now I'm completely sunk. This guy is going to ruin me. And then another deep voice said, yeah, and I deserve it. And Greg knew the second voice was telling the truth. He said, Mr. Z, in a voice so weak it was hard to hear. Mr. Z said, yes. I'm sorry about the blood stuff. And after I saw it, made you sick. Mara's right. It was mean, and I'm sorry. Mr. Z was quiet, and then he said, I know it's irrational, my reaction to that. It's only a liquid, and only a word. But seeing it, and hearing that word, and thinking about it, it gets me every time. Greg thought a moment. He said, with me, it's snakes. And lying there on the floor, Greg shivered. I don't even like pictures of them. Mr. Z said, ah, yes, pictures. When I was in junior high, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I went to the public library and found a medical textbook. It had pictures. That was the end of my medical career. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Irrational. Anyway, apology accepted. After a moment, Mr. Z said, what about the other matter? Losing your temper over the little book. Any apologies for that? Greg didn't say anything. Mr. Z said, earlier, when I told you I was delayed in the office, I was looking through your student file and Mara's. You two have quite a history of conflict, and I thought I was going to be the big problem solver. I thought getting you to apologize would be a help for both of you. Greg turned his head to look at Mr. Z, moving a little so the legs of the desk didn't block his view. The teacher had his eyes shut, and his face still looked pale. But you don't understand, Greg said. About my comic books, I mean. I worked all summer. It's like this whole business I'm trying to start. And I'll make tons of money. And at the start of math class, I was thinking Mara would mess it up all up. What? You don't think? What? You don't think that anymore? Asked Mr. Z. Not really, Greg said. I got a better look at her mini book. She's drawing all her pictures by hand and making her book one at a time. And you're not? No, Greg said. I make one original and then print the rest using a copier. Ah, Mr. Z said. Mass production. Economics. Economies of scale. Increase profit. A market dominance, right? Greg only understood about half that, but he said, right. I can make 40 or 50 copies an hour, and the materials cost around 2 cents per copy. Then I sell each one for a quarter. And I've got about 20 more copies all planned out. Mr. Z opened his eyes and turned his head to look at Greg. You see that? talking was good, helped me understand. So why don't you just talk to Mara? Greg shrugged. Because she's so annoying. Mr. Z's eyes drifted to the blood on Greg's shirt, and he quickly turned his eyes to the ceiling. He said, I've got a theory about why you two keep fighting. You're both very much alike, and you are each too stubborn to take a step toward being friends. Greg wasn't sure what to say to that, and while he was thinking, Mara came back into the room with the principal right behind her. Miss Davenport said, My goodness, looks like an emergency room in here. A bleeder and a fainter come face to face. What are the odds of that? If we can patch up the math teacher, he can run the numbers and figure that out. She chuckled. Miss Emmett's gone, so I'm your nurse, like it or not. She went to Greg first and handed him a cold pack. Mara tells me you already knew what to do with this. Greg nodded and pressed the blue plastic bag against his nose. The principal gave a towel and a cold pack to Mr. Z. Then she pulled the desk closer and lifted his foot onto a seat. Get the feet above the head. That's first aid for big, strong, swooning victims. Miss Davenport chuckled again. Mr. Z did not. The principal said, Greg, I've already called your mother, and she'll meet you at home. Mara's mother's coming in about 5 minutes, and she's driving you both. Then she turned to Mara and said, Would you go to the girls' room across the hall for me? Wet paper towels. We've got to get Greg cleaned up so that Mr. Xenotopoulos can get cleaned up Xenotopoulos can get up off the floor. Or we could just wait until it gets dark and all the blood becomes invisible. She chuckled and then said, Sorry about the jokes. I'm just relieved this isn't more serious. Then, turning back to Mr. Z, she said, And I know I know all the other teachers will also be relieved when I tell them all about this tomorrow. More chuckles. Greg had never heard Miss Davenport make a joke before, had not known such a thing was possible. And lying there on the floor, Greg thought, Mr. Z is going to get teased by the teachers tomorrow because blood makes him faint. And I'm going to get teased by the kids because I got a black eye from a girl. Miss Davenport used the wet paper towels to clean up Greg's face, and then the desk and the floor. It was a big mess, and before she was done, Mara had to go back for more supplies. All right, Greg, up you go. Slowly. And keep your head steady. Miss Davenport helped Greg to his feet and then into a desk. Stay put while Mara waits for her mother out front. I've got to get back to the office. Mr. Z, will you be all right for another few minutes? Or shall I call an ambulance? Greg could hear her chuckling as she walked away. He looked down at Mr. Z and said, Does she always joke around like that with teachers? 'Cause she's not like that with kids. Mr. Z smiled weakly. It didn't seem proper to talk about Miss Davenport. while with a student. So he said, most teachers have a sense of humor, and that includes the principal. Greg stared down at his blue and white soccer shirt, now streaked with blood. Greg thought, red, white, and blue. Very patriotic. He moved the desk so Mr. Z wouldn't be able to see his front. And then he thought of a question. So, Mr. Z, do you wish sometimes that you could have been a doctor, like you said? Or maybe some other job like that? I mean, instead of just being a teacher? Because if you had been a doctor, you'd probably be really rich by now. Doctors make so much money. You know, Ed McNamara, McNamara. His dad's a doctor, and they're super rich. Mr. Z did not want to discuss his personal life. He just laughed a little and said, my older brother's a doctor. He's not rich. Really? Greg was surprised. How come? Because he lives in a part of Idaho where they needed a good doctor, but there wasn't a lot of money to pay for one. Greg said, so how come your brother doesn't move to Chicago or Florida or some place like that? Mr. Z shrugged. We haven't talked about it much, but I know he likes where he lives, and he likes his work there. He's not rich, but he certainly has enough. And for him, enough is enough. Greg said, well, I guess that's okay for some people, but I want to be really, really rich. I'm going to make millions and millions. Said Mr. Z. And what's all this money going to be used for, he asked. Money? Greg looked at Mr. Z as if he was an alien. What's all the money for? To buy stuff, to go places, to get whatever I want, and to do anything I want. That's what money's for. Mr. Z said, so if you had all the money you wanted, what would you do? Greg shrugged. Anything I wanted to. I could do anything. Mr. Z nodded. Right, but give me an example. Okay, Greg said. Like the house we live in now, my parents' house. It's not very big. 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, a basement, playroom, a family room, just a regular house. So, if I had enough money, I'd buy a house with something like 10 bedrooms and 15 bathrooms and 2 swimming pools and this huge entertainment center with a home theater and surround sound and bass boosters and a pool table and air hockey too, stuff like that. Mr. Z raised his eyebrows. Interesting. It was the way Mr. Z said interesting. Something in the tone and the timing. Greg felt a hint of disapproval from the math teacher, and that annoyed him. Greg said, so you're saying that teachers get paid enough and that you don't want more money, right? And you're saying that you don't want a bigger house with fun stuff all over the place and more bedrooms and bathrooms? Is that what you're saying? Mr. Z smiled. I'm not saying anything, but I will tell you something that I call the Mr. Z toilet theory. Most people can only use one bathroom at a time. After they both laughed a little, The room was quiet for a minute or so. Then Mr. Z said, what I was saying earlier, how you should be flattered that Mara tried to copy you. I wasn't kidding. Ever hear the old saying, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery? I think that Mara thinks that you are interesting. Greg made a face. No way. You know how teachers can tell which boys in sixth grade like girls? Greg shook his head, and he wished Mr. Z would stop talking. He wanted to put his hands over his ears and sing Yankee Doodle. These were things he didn't want to know. Mr. Z went on. Girls like the boys that they're always mad at, or shoving, or turning their heads away from, or sticking their tongues out at. Never fails. From down the hall, Miss Davenport called, Greg, Miss Shaw's here. Need any help? Greg called back, no, I'm okay. He jumped up. He wanted to leave the room before Mr. Z found something else embarrassing to say. Holding the tissues and the cold pack in one hand, Greg got his things together. Mr. Z said, could you leave me a copy of your comic book? I'd like to take a better look at it. Greg said, sure. It's still there on the desk with Mara's. You can have it, free. He hurried to the doorway, but then paused and turned back. Listen, Mr. Z, I'm really sorry about making a mess in your room. Both times. Mr. Z said, a second apology, also accepted. That's two for me. One more apology for Mora, and you'll be all caught up. Greg didn't smile. In his mind, he said, don't count on it. Out loud, he said, well, we'll see tomorrow. Yes, said Mr. Z. And if I'm still on the floor here when you come to class 22 hours, then Miss Davenport should call the ambulance. As Greg headed to the front doors, it was Mr. Z who was chuckling.